And my hope is by the end of the session, you'll also get the benefit of understanding what are the main attributes of blockchain that are important, because oftentimes people know what blockchain is, but they don't necessarily know all the pieces and parts. And so my goal would be that by the time you leave, you actually know what those important parts are and then why Exchange is so unique. So we often talk about how standardization enables multiple generations of hypergrowth. If you think about the railroad industry, there was a lot of innovation around transport with railroads, but at the end of the day, the gauge of the track was a limiting factor for interconnectivity. And until there were standards around that gauge of track, there were real problems around having universal car sizes and transporting from one coast to another, interlocking the rail yards to be able to load things and unload them. And it all comes down to that standard of that track. You look at the Chicago fire, I use this example a lot. You know, during the Chicago fire, Chicago didn't have to burn down. There were plenty of firefighters able to put the fire out. The problem was all the firefighters that came in from the suburbs didn't have the same size hose bibs as the hydrants and the infrastructure in Chicago. And so you had a whole bunch of firefighters who actually couldn't help solve the problem. And then the last example is the origination of teleco. There wasn't this notion of standardization of transport, and so every vendor who competed for business had to have their own wires. And you can imagine what a problem that is. And so in that case, it was regulation. In other cases, it was innovation. But at the end of the day, that standardization enabled next generation hypergrowth. And so we believe that blockchain represents a huge opportunity for standardization, specifically in advertising, where that next level of hypergrowth can happen. It's already been shown to be doing that in other industries, and there's countless examples. So what are the attributes of a blockchain, and why are they important? I'm going to walk through these attributes. The first is a distributed ledger. Second is decentralization, so no central authority element. The third is a proof of X, proof of work, proof of stake. In our case, we have a thing called a proof of adserve, which is very innovative because our proof model corresponds directly to something that's useful in our industry. And in most of these blockchains, it's really just doing mathematical compute in order to prove that it has synchronization, and that's unique in our model. That's really kind of interesting. And the last one is the notion of smart contracts. And fundamentally, blockchain is made up of smart contracts like Bitcoin or Ethereum. Most of those contracts are person-to-person payment of stored value of some kind. In our case, the smart contract is in fact the insertion order, and it has all the targeting rules, pacing rules, frequency capping, all the elements involved with what you want to do when you buy and sell media. And so you're not dealing with things like what tags are you running on? Am I able to piggyback tags on top of each other? Oh, it didn't get trafficked right. My ad ops person knew that they needed to do this, but at the end of the day, they didn't. Apologize. You know, all that stuff, if codified correctly in a decentralized model, all that goes away in an interesting way. So what is the distributed ledger? So back on the education, the notion is that instead of having a hub and spoke model that is a central authority, every node is synchronized, and that there's this notion of consensus that ensures that that decentralization is effective. And so if you're to look at the current model of ads, all the impressions get, at the end of the day, loaded in to one of a few different central places, and all the buyers get loaded in at the exact same place to be able to either take that inventory or auction it in real time as it's happening. And in this model, it's completely decentralized. So this notion of proof of stake, proof of work, if you have all these nodes all over the network and they're all supposed to have synchronized data, the question is, how do you ensure that there isn't a rogue node and that there isn't incorrect data? And so in blockchain, you have this notion of consensus, and it's the protocols that ensure that the nodes have the same data, so it's trustworthy. And there's different ways in which you can create that consensus. In Bitcoin, it's through what's called proof of work. In Ethereum, today, it's proof of work, and they're contemplating and moving forward with a proof of stake model. In our model, We really take a really interesting approach in that it's a decentralized proof of stake against a multi-dimensional blockchain. I'll walk through that in a moment, but the reason this is important is you can't have decentralization unless there's consensus. And the number one reason why people think and discount blockchain for advertising is they think of consensus in the context of Bitcoin and Ethereum, which presently are at like 10 transactions a second. There's no way in hell this is going to apply in advertising if you're only able to deal with 10 transactions a second. And so our approach was to say consensus and the peer-to-peer protocol have to get nailed. And if you nail it right, you could have decentralization with consensus and handle million-plus transactions a second. And if you can do all those things, you're cooking with gas with regard to applying blockchain to digital ads. And so that's what we've done, and I'll walk through why and how. So the last element of the 4 elements of a blockchain is the smart contract. I talked a little bit about how smart contract is typically considered stored value payment from one wallet to another. In our case, it's an insertion order. Think of a smart contract as a vending machine, much like that picture. In the vending machine, there is no quote-unquote intermediary. You put a coin in, you pick your product, and it comes out. The smart contract of the vending machine knows that when money goes in, product comes out. And it's that simple. Whether a smart contract, you could probably apply the same kind of logic to a fast track badge on your car. You drive through, it scans, you get billed. Period, the end. Super simple. Same concept here in that you have a library of smart contracts. The logic of the smart contract is actually codified. It's written in code, and then it's distributed across all those decentralized nodes. So you think about the application of that in the context of our business collectively as an industry, it's in ads. And instead of having a PDF that you sign, which is your insertion order, and then an enormous chasm the size of the Grand Canyon until ad ops actually gets delivered and trafficked. The notion is that you sign a PDF that's the legally binding agreement, but the smart contracts, or the myriad of smart contracts, manifest the rules of serve, measurement, ratings, delivery, and payment. And that is all through a life cycle and a workflow that enables partners to be able to, or other companies, to participate on this open source blockchain to facilitate that workflow. So today, you've got this central world, buy side, sell side, publishers, advertisers, and tomorrow you have this model where between the advertiser and the publisher, you have protocols, which is a term that people use a lot in the blockchain space, but much like HTTP is a protocol that runs on top of TCP, which is the communication framework of the internet. HTTP is the mechanism that does web content transmission between a web server and a browser. These protocols, instead of being transmission of content from a web server to a browser, these protocols are used for the discovery of inventory, the discovery of demand, the clearing of a buyer and a seller on a particular audience, the locking down that into a smart contract, the activation of that smart contract with regard to ad serve, the writing to the chain of every impression to prove that that smart contract is being fulfilled, the participation by measurement companies to be able to clear transactions to say, yep, I can prove both on-chain and off-chain that these things happened. And so I'm verifying that as a third party. Or finally, ratings and payment. So ratings, you know, the great story, the team of Airbnb early on, they didn't have a rating system for Airbnb. And they struggled because who wants to rent a room for a night in someone's house and you don't know if they're creepy? Like, ratings are really important for that business, right? And it's amazing they didn't have that vision on day one, because that's kind of critical to that feedback loop. In the same way, if you've got this open system for buying and selling media, as a seller, you don't know if a buyer is quote unquote creepy. As a seller, or as a buyer, you don't know if a seller is creepy. Will they deliver? What's their fraud index? Is their inventory consistent with what they say it is when it's actually measured and delivered in other use cases? So we have a first-class actor role as a ratings provider, and there could be a whole myriad of companies that could end up building their businesses to be ratings providers on this open blockchain. And then finally, payment providers. We recognize that big brands and big agencies, they're not going to have a crypto wallet to buy media, even though this whole system runs on a tokenized framework. They're going to want to pay with their controller on net 90 terms with cash, period, the end. We're not going to change that behavior. And the way we're not going to change that is because we have these first-class payment providers who stand in between, facilitate the token movement, but enable almost like an escrow against this system to allow for payments in and payments out in cash on a variety of currencies. So the point here is this is an ecosystem play that's entirely open sourced, enabling a lot of different companies to participate in this petri dish and this culture that gets developed under the premise that what Facebook and Google have done is they've demonstrated how well they've executed in making the supply chain invisible to a buyer. It's easy to buy media on Facebook, and that's why so many people do, and it's terrific. If you want to go buy media at the same scale, worry about fraud, deal with data enrichment to do audience targeting, make sure delivery happens, and have enough scale, and it's not on Facebook and Google, you have a whole team of UA specialists, just like you guys do today, because it's hard. And so the premise here is that this is all reduced down to a protocol framework with no intermediary, not Kochava, not anyone else. So we're building this open source system under the premise that with better rails, with a common framework of the telecom wires, with common hose bibs, there is a capacity to hit new levels of scale, and that can be unified and demonstrated. So blockchain architecture, I kind of spoke to this a little bit. We have built this system from the ground up as our own blockchain. This is not on Ethereum. This is not a Fabric roll-up of a blockchain on Fabric or Tendermint. We wrote this thing from the ground up for speed and efficiency and first-class actors that are specific to advertising. So we're not trying to stick a round peg through a square hole and say, look at us, we have blockchain for ads. This is not a sizzle play. It's really a thing that is real tech. And we're already recruiting partners to be, quote unquote, on exchange to bring their supply on the system. I'm going to speak to that a little bit later, but fundamentally we have folks like AppLift, PubNative, InMobi, DCMN. I'm going to forget someone and it's going to be offensive, but there's 15 or so partners already signed to be writing on the blockchain, to bring their inventory on there, as well as DSPs who are wanting to buy against it. And so our next round of recruitment is effectively bringing the technology actors like payment providers and ratings providers to be able to add value in that ecosystem as well. So last slide. Oftentimes, once people are familiar with the ingredients of blockchain, they understand generally what we're doing, they then kind of ask all the same questions over again. They say, now, isn't blockchain slow? How are we going to do that? Don't you have a problem if all this data is open? How are you going to do that? So we really highlight on this last slide some of the notable elements of this architecture that specifically cater to challenges in advertising. So one is the integrated protocols. We've talked about that. That's for demand discovery, audience discovery, price discovery, locking down leads to closed IOs, our smart contract, which we believe there's going to be a whole library of smart contract templates. There are going to be potentially highly targeted audience-based smart contract. There could be general run-of-network-like smart contracts. The whole notion is that these are going to be a variety of templates that will be used or standardized upon by various different folks, or you could roll your own. This notion of side chains. So the reason why the other blockchains are so slow is because every node synchronizes, and when I say node, a machine that's on the network that's doing all this decentralization. Every node synchronizes every transaction. In our world, we have a 4-dimensional blockchain. The insertion order, the line items, the roll-ups, and the transaction detail. So we're getting impression level detail on a blockchain, decentralized, and separate blockchains that are doing the roll-ups, separate blockchains that are then linking it to the line items, and then a separate entire that goes to the world chain, which is the IO chain. The reason that's important is when you combine a sharded blockchain framework like we've built with a decentralized consensus framework, we have the system electing which validator nodes, synchronizers, they're synchronizing all this data, which validator nodes validate what data sets off of what vectored chains. And this is the reason we're able to pull off the 1 million plus transactions a second. If all of that went way over your head, it's totally fine. The point is, volumes are covered, and it's because of that. Distributed file system. You know, there's a very valuable thing in the world that we live in together, which is DMPs, helps you target audiences and understand things about those audiences that are not self-apparent as you see impressions come through the pipes. And when you have a decentralized blockchain framework for ads, you need to codify that data decentralized. And so we've come up with some really interesting innovation around decentralized file systems that are queryable and are not overburdensome, because as we all know, advertising has lots and lots of data, and you don't want to burden different people for data that they're not responsible for. So we've come up with some really interesting innovation there. And then finally, this notion of a daily rolling chain. If you guys know anything about blockchains, you know that when you download a node, it has to catch up with everyone else on the network, so it kind of downloads all the data and then it synchronizes it and makes sure that it has consensus with everyone else. In our model, we have this concept called a DRC, a daily rolling chain. And the notion is it's like heavy, heavy pruning. So every day, all that record level data gets wiped out on all those side chains. And only the actors who are responsible to participate and serve customers or are the customer otherwise, they're already pulling that data off the chain, so they don't need it. So it makes for a really lightweight network infrastructure for an industry that is very heavy in terms of volumes of data. So with that, I want to open it up with questions. We could spend lots and lots of time talking about this, but at the same time, I'll end up talking about some of the same topics that I'm excited about. It may not be what you're interested in. So I would love to hear if there's questions. Sir.
So question on, do you want to open this up to the rest of the industry? It's going to be proprietary to Kochava. Can Attune, can other attribution partners join in on this to be a collaborative effort in the industry?
Yeah, so it's an open source system that we're building. You mentioned Tune. They're a measurement partner, or they're a measurement company. So I can see the kind of connection, like, are you going to let these other guys do this? The whole principle of being open is that it's open. And so we believe that there's great value in what this thing is. And measurement is only one of 4 actor types. There's payments, ratings, dispute resolution, and data augmentation or data enrichment. So the answer is yes, it's open.
The other question would
Yeah.
be, can you get behind, like the IAB getting behind this? How
Yeah.
to work with an association?
Great question.
To drive this?
So we were one of the first 4 founding members of the IAB Tech Lab for blockchain. We're one of only 3 projects that actually has code in blockchain in this tech lab with the IAB. There's probably 200 companies that are participating in this IAB program, or this tech lab thing. And because we actually have product, we were nominated to be a program track. And what we're doing is anyone who wants to be on that program track, they just become an on-exchange partner, and they get access. They see the roadmap, they participate, they give feedback, et cetera. And IAB is an interesting one. I think if you're not already going here, it's a good thing to kind of call out here. You know, if you think about the IOs that you guys either sign or are asked to sign by your customers at advertising companies, those are IAB standard IO terms. And so we want the IAB to be part of the standard setting of those templates of the smart contracts, so that it's IAB designating that stuff, not one or a collection of companies. Yep. Any other questions? Terry.
So what is the role of Kochava? Are you running the
Yep, yep.
I wanted to see, number one, how do you view Kochava's role? And then number two, how does that, does the buyer and the seller, do they have to use your terms?
Yep, all good questions. So we think of Kochava as a benevolent curator. Question for anyone that didn't hear, what's your role as Kochava in the process of this? Call it benevolent curator. We've built all this code. We're making it open because our whole framework is based on this notion of proof of stake. Stake is what designates governance. And so we're making the token available as a token sale to preferably every industry player that wants to participate, because not only does it represent stake in terms of governance, it also represents consensus, because the greater the stake of a particular actor, the greater trust in the synchronization of that data. And so we don't want a huge group of crypto investors owning stake in a system that doesn't have to do with this industry. And so we've been working for 3 months getting different companies who want to be involved, and by being involved, they have stake, which is part of that token sale. In addition to that, we have, out of all the tokens that are in the system, and we have a capped number of tokens in this framework, but we have over a third of the tokens designated for incentives for all of the publisher ecosystem partners that are bringing their inventory onto exchange. So think of that as a cash payment to incentivize integrating this open source blockchain system into their waterfall of their ad server. And we designated that front end, so it's there to be used to develop it. So the reason I say kind of benevolent curator is I found, I've been a part of a lot of open source projects, and I found that once you have code, progress happens. If you're just having conference calls, nothing happens. And we really want to get this thing out the door and then let governance be driven off of stake so that the right participants are involved with the roadmap moving forward. Does that answer it? Any other? Yep. Sure.
Can you talk more about the consensus nodes? You said proof of ad serving. So
yeah, I didn't really get into that. I'm sorry.
Are these like publishers where they have ad placements and they're serving it are consensus nodes, or are these companies or partners that you've partnered with who are basically doing your consensus?
Yep. So we have 2 mining techniques in exchange. One is a combo of the other. So on the one, it's just a validator node. And so based on your stake, you would have a miner whose job it is to be a validator of transactions based on the election by the system. The other approach is what we call an ad serving miner. And an ad serving miner, you take our ad serve mining software, deploy it in Amazon or Google or on a data center, and its job is to serve an ad in under 20 to 50 milliseconds based on a request from the integration points that a publisher integrates within their waterfall for ad requests. So when an impression comes through the waterfall, it does a real-time call out to the network of miners out there, and the miners are aware, based on serve orders in the blockchain, of what to serve based on these different dynamics of that impression. If there is something that they're supposed to serve, they serve it. If there isn't, they return and say, I have no ad, and the publisher's waterfall continues on and they monetize as they always have in the past. This way, you don't ask a publisher who's making money that pays payroll every day to just turn off that monetization source and then turn on this other one. It allows them to feather that in, and as demand increases, so does the IOs on the smart contract, so does the responses from the system to the ad serving miner. Now, that ad serving miner earns a transaction fee for being an ad server. But if it's a beefy enough machine on that node, they also can be a general consensus validator node, which allows them to have more fee in that process. Does that make sense?
Does the client need to be a Kochava attribution client to also have exchange, or are they independent?
Totally independent. And it's kind of related to Terry's earlier question, that this is a framework that we wanted to be open. So a client who wants to buy media is agreeing to targeting dynamics, inventory dynamics, all the details about the I/O, but they're also saying, and I want to use this ratings provider, I want to use this measurement provider, I want to use this payment provider, and that's all locked into that smart contract.
And that's your point about multi-dimensional.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yes, sir.
What sort of participation are you seeing from the likes of Google, Facebook, and Twitter, Kochava?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll tell you, we've had inbounds from all of them, from various different groups ever since we started talking about it. I don't have great expectations that these very successful centralized ad marketplaces are going to say, fantastic, let's throw it in, right? Having said that, I don't think that matters, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way towards those companies, because I think what this represents is the trifecta of Facebook, Google, and then everything else in exchange. I know it sounds boisterous to say that because there's a huge assumption that everyone's going to just put their inventory in there. My argument is today, if you're a publisher, you have great motivation and temptation to become a fan pub, or great motivation and temptation to be on AdMob. And what's that motivation? Monetization. If demand is there and you're clean and you have good ratings, I would argue you're probably going to have a higher yield on a system that doesn't have an intermediary. And I think that's just a reality of economics. And so I think that's a cool, self-fulfilling incentive that no one has to push on their own. It just happens. But obviously we have to build it out and deploy it. Sir.
So I like your comment about enough of the conference calls, let's get this thing done. What's
Yeah.
your timeline?
Yeah. Yeah, so we're spending this entire year integrating with pubs. And our intent is the beginning of next year, and technology vendors, obviously.
Yeah, if they're throwing out dates and say we're going to launch this date.
Yeah, well, the date is the beginning of New Year. Yeah.
I just want to think about, I have no doubt, I feel like we're able to, people will join because of time, because of the solution, because that's what they want. But I feel like whether we are, after a year, this will be stay there, the key is we have a solution to anti-fraud, or we have a way to allow more developers, since we're open source architecture protocol, there should be a way to self-involved or allow those developers, allow those solution providers like an app store or any way to open for them to improve
Totally.
it.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah, and that's, so when we started building this, the discussion we were having internally was, are we really seriously contemplating spending as much money as we have and plan on continuing to spend, and then open sourcing that? Like, that seems ridiculous. We're a bootstrapped, profitable company. That doesn't mean we're crazy, but we actually have great flexibility and agility as a result of that. And so it's a really damn good idea, and so we decided to do that. Now, no one in their right mind with an enterprise company is going to integrate a blockchain system that is proprietary to one company. And so it has to be open source. And so that's exactly kind of a +1 on your comment. And as part of that, the reason why this ongoing governance thing is so important is because it's not going to be done at Rev 1. There's going to be constant innovation. We've already been approached by a number of tokenized rewarded ad networks that are brand new in garages who want to do an ICO on exchange. Now get your head around that. So they're ad tech, they're tokenizing. Why in the hell would they do that on Ethereum? It's a really good point. They should just do it on this core chain. And that is really interesting innovation, because now all of a sudden the ecosystem plays. One behind you.
Why will they do it on exchange and on Ethereum?
Because of the volume support, the transactional volume support, and the ability, my argument is the ability to have it natively integrated into this larger, now I'm talking specifically about these rewarded, incentive tokenized products, but if you're a media source and you don't integrate with an attribution vendor, it's tough to sell your media to advertisers. In the same way, I think there's a a similar linkage, where if you're in the media space and you want to do something blockchain-oriented, you're going to have to decide what's the blockchain you're going to be on. And I would argue the high-performance one is going to be the one people are going to lead to if they're in ads. I'm not doing a very good job of designation. Sorry, one more, or, sorry.
So I'm not that informed on blockchain, but I'm curious.
You are now.
Well, now I
Just
am,
did the
yeah.
101.
You know, getting the buy-in from various stakeholders, that's important, and it seems like it's easier in perhaps Western markets, right? And how are you going to get buy-in from countries where maybe there's a crackdown on these sort of activities, right?
Yeah.
So in South Korea or China or what have you.
Yeah, so I would argue that there's actually greater success in the European theater and the Asian theater at large, and I know there's a lot of discussion about crackdown, and that's totally true. Having said that, I would argue China is a year plus ahead of anyone else in terms of blockchain infrastructure. It's just the monetary policy of tokenization is something that the Chinese government isn't super excited about. And so that's the crackdown. It's not so much the tech part. And so what's interesting is I think there is great, if you buy media today in the US, there's a way to do it. You buy media in Europe, there's a way to do it. You buy media in China, whole nother way to do it, like completely different. Buy media in Japan, like you can't even like pay people. You've got to find an agency because people won't actually take your check, like totally different. And so there's this really interesting almost payment efficiency model that ends up happening where if it's all tokenized, I can be a publisher who's earning money on my ads, but by virtue of that, I'm also a UA buyer because I want to strengthen the size of my audience so I can earn more ads. And so now you've got this virtuous cycle that's token backed. And I would argue that because of the international complexities around payment, we've actually seen more interest than I was even expecting for the same reasons you just described. So I think it's kind of a misnomer, if you will. You had a question.
Yeah, I was curious about the compatibility with ad formats. Is this going to be compatible with our like standard IMRAID, VAST, or is
that's
it
exactly the idea. It has to be because that's the infrastructure that people have. And so that's the beauty of the smart contract in that all those ad-serving nodes that are the ad-serving miners, they're effectively CDNs as well as ad servers. And the form and format has to be consistent with what people are used to and the tech that's there.
Very interesting.
Awesome questions, by the way. I'm loving the discussion. Anything else? Well, we would love if you're a publisher, if you're an ad network, if you're an SSP, if you're a DSP, we would love to have you guys involved as an on-exchange partner. That we've got a bunch that have signed that we haven't yet announced. We did an announcement today for some new advisors, as well as some new partners that are on exchange, but I expect that that's going to just continue. We have monthly roadmap meetings where we share with those people that are part of the on-exchange program all this visibility. Testnet is going to be available to them mid-year, which is pretty exciting, and we'd love to have you involved. Okay.